Welcome, my dear students and listeners. The lecture today will be on poetry. That what is poetry and what are the types of poetry? So let's define the word poetry first. What is poetry? So this topic has been defined by different poets in different ways and words. As we will quote here William Wordsworth, who was a great poet of the Romantic period. William Wordsworth says about poetry that the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, and it takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. This is called poetry, William Wordsworth says. Now, William Hazlitt says that poetry is the language of imagination and patience. And Thomas Hardy says that poetry is emotion put into measure. Shelley, who was a great poet of the Romantic period, says about poetry that poetry is the record of the best and happiest moments of the happiest and best minds. And Coleridge says the best words in their best order is called poetry, and so on. So, to sum up all these definition, the poetry is the expression of thoughts and feelings in verse or poetical form. And there are two types of poetry as you can see on the screen. The one is subjective poetry and the other is objective poetry. Then subjective poetry is subdivided into lyric, ode, elegy, sonnet, and objective poetry is divided into epic and ballad. So let me define subjective poetry first. That what is subjective poetry? In subjective poetry, a poet expresses his own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. The word subjective refers to a particular point of view based on someone's personal opinion and beliefs. Subjective poetry is often called personal poetry, and there are four types of subjective poetry as you can see in the screen. Number one, lyric. Number two, elegy. Number three, ode, and number four, sonnet. So let's define these one by one. First, what is lyric? So, lyric it is a short poem that includes musical qualities having a rhyming scheme. And number two, what is elegy? Elegy is a poem in which the poet mourns the death of someone beloved and it has serious theme. Number three is ode. Ode is a form in which the poet directly addresses someone, something, or describe nature, as John Keats' ode on a Grecian arm. And number four is sonnet. So, what is sonnet? Sonnet is a poem of 14 lines having a rhyme and a rhythm. And there are further types of sonnets, but they will be discussed in next lecture. And now, what is objective poetry? So, objective poetry is the opposite of subjective poetry. Objective poetry is the contrast of subjective poetry. In objective poetry, the poet describes external events and objects. In objective poetry, the poet acts as an observer and providing a clear view of external events and objects. The objective poetry is also called external or impersonal poetry. So, this objective poetry is further divided into epic and ballad. Now, what is epic? So, epic is a lengthy narrative poem that describes heroic deeds and adventures. Epic is always lofty in style, and epic often involve divine intervention and mythical creatures, as Homer's Iliad and Odyssey or John Milton's Paradise Lost. So, these are the best examples of epic poetry. And the last one you can see is ballad. What is a ballad? A ballad is a poem that tells a story in short lines or stanzas. Let, for example, the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Tyler Coleridge. So, this was the definitions of poetry you heard, and the types of poetry. Number one is subjective poetry, and number two is objective poetry. Subjective poetry is a personal poetry, and you can say objective poetry is an external poetry. So let it call a day. And if you are new in the channel, please subscribe my channel to receive such videos on linguistics and literature. Thank you very much.